Hello, Dr. Loretta Erhunmwunsee. Thank you so much for joining us today for our second installment in the AHPBA Research Committee's School of Equitable Research Extra Credit web series. Dr. Erhunmwunsee is a thoracic surgeon and lung cancer disparities researcher, and her work centers on how the biologic effects of poverty cause more aggressive lung malignancies. She also studies social determinants of health, and Dr. Erhunmwunsee is particularly passionate about understanding how social and biologic factors can be modified to make life healthier for all lung cancer patients. She was then highly sought after, and we were very lucky to have her come to City of Hope, where she has added value to the lives of everyone here every single minute since. Dr. Erhunmwunsee, thanks so much for being with us today.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you. That was an amazing introduction. Thanks, Dr. Wynn.
So I would first love to ask you to elaborate on the main focus of your work.
I think strongly about how adverse social determinants impact the biology of lung cancer patients, in particular, how this impact or this link might lead to the race-based disparities that we see. And so we understand that African Americans have the highest incidence of lung cancer and the highest mortality from the disease. And the question is, how do adverse social determinants impact that? Because African Americans also, unfortunately, have the largest exposure to these determinants. And I also am looking at how racism specifically and racist policies that have been around for decades and longer impact some of these disparities that we're seeing in African Americans. So that's one bucket. And then the second is I think about lung cancer screening and how it is implemented in underserved areas. And so I try to be impactful in that regard as well.
As you know, so this is for our AHPBA members, but also anyone else hoping to achieve excellence in their research. How do you think your work in lung cancer could be a roadmap for people who work in other solid tumors who can identify modifiable risk factors for their patients?
Yeah, no, so I think that's a great question. I think, there's probably two parts to that. One is, I think it's very important to sort of look around and try to serve, for lack of a better word, the folks who have the greatest needs, right? And when you do that, usually, those patients are going to be marginalized in some way. And so frequently it's going to be your minority patients, specifically your underrepresented minority patients, or your patients who have low socioeconomic status and low resources. And so if no matter what lane you're in, you're thinking about the patients who have the lowest access or who have the worst outcomes, many times it's going to be, the patients who are the most marginalized. And then I think you start thinking about why these results happen. And so there could be many different ways to get to that. For me, I kept reading about how African Americans had worse outcomes, and I thought, well, goodness gracious, why? And so I started thinking about neighborhood, and I started thinking about other adverse social determinants, including pollution and deprivation. And so I think it's a step-by-step process that starts with, hey, looking at the patients who have the highest risk, who are doing the worst, figuring out some of the gaps that are there, and then trying to determine how you potentially can better understand it or potentially intervene.
That's wonderful. Would you agree that with the statement that we cannot achieve, in that same vein, when we elevate everybody, that we cannot achieve academic excellence without equity? And if yes, how can we normalize moves toward diverse and inclusive research in every arena, not just the social determinants?
Right. So I would say I don't know how strongly you can agree with the statement. And I agree with it at that level, meaning that, in my mind, we can't be excellent if there is a huge disparity gap, right? Like you can't consider that we're doing excellent work, whether it's, as surgeons, we help push the envelope with technology and potentially with like robotic technology or other minimally invasive technology or other high-tech AI potentially influenced interventions. If, for instance, not everyone gets access to it, right? So and so even when we think about our precision medicine and our and all of the great things, the CAR Ts and the clinical trials that we as a medical society and a research society have been able to really push forward, like there's a lot of that, there's this excitement there. But when we can't and aren't getting it to the people who are most in need, when we aren't getting it to the people who have been marginalized for decades or centuries, when we aren't allowing everyone access to the excellence that we're creating, it isn't excellent, right? And that is the reason why I think that I agree so strongly with your statement, because the truth is, until we can give it and make sure that every patient, everybody, every soul gets access to the excellent stuff that we are creating and pushing forward, we really are, one, making the disparities worse, right? Like, let's be clear. Every time we create a new intervention, every time there's a new drug, a trial, there's a period of time where the marginalized aren't getting access, right? And so then the folks with resources obtain it, and then there's a gap, right? And it takes some time before that gap narrows before the next thing. And so in essence, we've got to make sure that every patient, particularly those who are marginalized, particularly those who have the most risk, are getting access to all of the things that we're doing. And until then, we aren't equitable and we aren't excellent.
Yeah. Transitioning a bit into how we can make that excellence be part of every single thing we do. So can you speak to surgeons and physicians with research interests that are well focused, say, on pathway work or things that maybe don't seem to fit under what some view as an umbrella of disparities research, who might feel powerless to affect positive change in their research? How can people like that incorporate equitable initiatives into every facet of their own work?
Right. Well, so maybe we start small and we say, when you're thinking about your pathway work, or when you're thinking about your intervention, or when you're thinking about creating a new educational plan, specifically, maybe as a first step, think about the people who have the worst outcomes, right? If you start there, maybe, like having a paradigm or a regimen that is good for everyone is important. I'm not going to say that, but at the same time, like, maybe taking a step back and saying, okay, within this disease, or within this group, who's actually doing the worst?
Yeah.
And then maybe specifically saying, okay, I want to assure that all that I'm doing is going to impact that group, right? So in some ways, it doesn't have to be really complicated, especially for the early stage investigator, right? Like, you don't want to make it more difficult, but I do think that there might be a place there, and we're in this new place where there is a lot of interest. Thank goodness we finally are getting here, where we are understanding that not really considering the marginalized and not considering those who have the most difficult time getting to care, is really a problem. And so there's funding opportunity, there are resources, and certainly there are collaboration efforts. And I think so that's one part. And then secondly, I do think it's very important for us to collaborate, right? Like, listen, you're in your bubble as this amazing basic scientist who's doing all of the fantastic work. But maybe you talk to someone who has more of a history thinking about other patients, or who might, have done disparities work in the past, and you just say, hey, look, I don't know the first thing about taking a step there. Can we do that work together, right? Can we talk about what it looks like? But I feel strongly that part of our issue today is that we act as if disparities work is like its own thing that's like siloed or put in, like that's over there, like it has its own sort of research session at the conference, when the truth is the way we get to equity and excellence is when we intertwine it, when we bring it, when we are always thinking about the gap, when we're always thinking about the people who are doing the poorest, right? Like if you always are thinking about them, then all of the work is impactful. I mean, I'm sure there's a better way to say that, but the point is, like, I think the way we get to true equity and excellence is when we're always thinking about the least of these, right? The marginalized, the group who needs more support, and we work to get it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Erhunmwunsee, for joining us on this edition of AHPBA's Research Committee School of Equitable Research Extra Credit. We've learned to always think about those who need your research most, to elevate the least of these, and when in doubt, to collaborate. And finally, we've learned that without equity, we cannot be excellent. Thank you so much for your time.